Hello and welcome to the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network's annual lecture, Studying Non-Religion in a Non-Religious Environment by Atko Remmel. My name is Emma Robinson, and I'm the project manager for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project, which is co-hosting today's event alongside the NSRN. As we begin, please join me for a land acknowledgement. While we gather virtually for this event from places near and far, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands we are on today, and acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across Canada. The Non-Religion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Thank you. I will now turn things over to Laurie Beeman, the president of the NSRN and principal investigator of the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project.
Thanks, Emma. Welcome, everyone. This is so wonderful. If nothing else, the pandemic has made us a little bit more comfortable with Zoom and webinars and the ability to meet around the world by video. And this event, the annual NSRN lecture, some of you will recall we would normally do it at the annual meeting, but we decided that meeting virtually is intense. And so we left the annual meeting as the annual meeting with conference sessions and so on, and decided to just shift the annual lecture, give us an excuse to meet together a little bit later on, and hopefully we'll be able to develop a series of meetings like this beyond the annual lecture. But it's a real privilege to be able to invite you to come and be here with us today. And hopefully, as I said, we will be able to do these kinds of events a little bit more frequently. It allows us to come together in those years in between our biannual meeting, and to be able to continue conversations in a little bit more consistent way. It also opens up the annual lecture to, I think, a broader audience. And we're simply delighted and grateful that all of you are here today. We're also delighted and grateful that Atko Remmel agreed to give us a lecture today. Atko, many of you know Atko. He's an assistant professor in religious studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. His academic interests are divided between intellectual history and sociology of religion. He's published on Soviet anti-religious policy and atheist propaganda. And we were just speaking a little bit about how things shift and change. And of course, in Estonia, the situation between Russia and Ukraine is a lot closer than for many of us on this side of the Atlantic. Atko has published numerous areas in addition to that, including secularization, historical and contemporary forms of religion, non-religion, and the link and junctures between non-religion and nationalism and nature. So Atko, without further ado, we've invited Atko to give about a 25 to 30-minute talk, and then we will invite questions and comments and conversation after. The entire event will end within the hour, and so hopefully you'll enjoy this as much as I know I'm going to. Atko, over to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction and also for the invitation to speak, and thank you everyone for joining. So my presentation today is about non-religion in Estonia. So when Jonathan Landman presented the Understanding Unbelief project results in 2020, he mentioned that the research on non-religion has clustered around unorganized non-religion, new atheism, and weird people. And I would add that non-religion has also been studied mostly in the context where religion is still a defining force in culture. And now in that respect, the situation is somewhat different in Estonia. So Estonia provides a possibility to study non-religion in the context where non-religion is very clearly a social norm. And of course, Estonia is not unique. I've seen my colleagues from Sweden and Czech Republic nod a lot when I tell them about my findings, and the topics, of course, come up in other contexts as well. But in Estonia, they seem a bit more expressed. So Estonia is a tiny country by the Baltic Sea. 69% ethnic Estonians, 25% ethnic Russians, and all traditional indicators for religiosity are actually much higher among Russians. And therefore, today I'm going to speak about non-religion within Estonian culture. Now, the three topics I'm going to address today is the aspects that impact non-religion in Estonia. Then I will share some of my findings among different generations of the non-religious. And finally, I'm going to reflect a bit on what it all tells us about non-religion. But first, before we go on, a short note on theoretical framework and methods. I have found Johannes Quack's notion of religion-related field especially helpful in defining the topic of research, and I'm also following him on relational approach for identifying non-religion, which means that all the entanglements between religion and non-religion are context-specific. So the focus on context also leads the focus on religion-related discourses. And here, Chris Cotter's recent book, Critical Study of Non-Religion, has been an excellent conversation partner, sometimes leading the way, sometimes confirming my choices, my findings and thoughts. So, a bit on data and methods. I have collected the data from very various sources, but today I'm going to rely mostly on my interviews with non-religious. My interviews have usually started with a very broad question, tell me about religion, and then I followed the topics that came up, but I also had some predefined questions. And in analyzing my material, I focus mainly on discourses, and I have paid special attention on certain recurring tropes and the expressions, cliches, and the discourses surrounding them. And the reason for that is I've been interested in influences of different intellectual traditions surrounding religion and non-religion, and these certain expressions work really fine as indicators of these traditions. And also they sometimes help to discover religion relatedness from really unusual places. And now we have this first example. It's an article about a theater play that came just out a couple of weeks ago. The director is my MA student who tries to hit two birds with one stone, writing her thesis and concurrently using the material for a play. And she interviewed 17 people about how it feels to live as a Christian in Estonia. And here you can see an article covering the play, and it tells us, the play takes a closer look at one part of the Estonian population, the believers, from a perspective of a common person. And then the text says, it would certainly be interesting to know how they became religious and what kind of life they lead. So this is a very, very good description about how normal people see the topic of religion. And there are very clear assumptions of the journalist. First, that believers are different from normal people, and secondly, that something has happened to them so that they ended up religious. And as you see, religion here is explicitly othered and treated as some kind of anomaly. And trying to explain this understanding of the situation, we should look back to Estonian Soviet past, which includes so-called forced secularization. And in comparison, for instance, with Great Britain, which according to Callum Brown started to secularize almost at the same time, the process in Estonia was very fast. And of course, the Soviets didn't succeed in eradicating religion, but what they achieved was eradicating religion from public sphere. And with the exception of the years during the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the situation is rather similar today. And by establishing the system of secular rituals and this religious socialization was quite effectively cut off. And as for atheist propaganda, it didn't actually change people into atheists, but it managed to attach negative connotations to religion. And also, in order to present Soviet atheism as more favorable, it was emphasized that atheism has been inherent to Estonian culture already before. And here they relied strongly on Estonian national narrative. Now, this narrative and then the overlap between Estonian national culture and non-religion is also present today. It originated from 19th century, but it's still there. And the main tropes are that Estonia was violently Christianized in 13th century by fire and sword. And also that religion was forced upon Estonians. And this narrative is widely used by Estonian neo-pagan movement called Maausk, or Earth Believers, that became public in the 80s. And this movement presents itself as a continuation of Estonians' ancient animist beliefs. And but due to its anti-Christian attitude and focus on protecting nature, they, rather than focusing on religious topics, they are widely recognized as not religious, and this has made them very popular. So, and now reaching to this generational approach to non-religion, my main goals were to identify the characteristics of Estonian non-religion and to see whether there are generational differences. And also, I was interested what could be this positive content of Estonian non-religiosity, what could be said about non-religion without describing it as a lack of religion. And initially, when planning my study, I divided my interlocutors into 3 age groups: the older, the middle-aged, and younger. And these groups were defined by the greater changes in Estonian religious history during the last 80 years or so. But as it turned out, there were actually only 2 groups: the older generation, which was socialized into religion, and the rest. And as you can see from these tables, religious identification is especially low among younger generations. And according to census, the people with religious identities in the youngest age group are less than 10%. And as we know, this is the mechanism behind that is religious socialization. I will cover the older generation very, very briefly. The main difference from the others was that they had a knowledge on the religion they differed from, which in Estonia is Lutheranism. And although they had lived most of their lives in Soviet context, so that their language and thinking was influenced by that era, I mean, the concepts and specific expressions and so on, but they also carried the traditions before that time, and they used also religious expressions like synon, Pharisaic, or blessing, and so on. And in a way, they are amphibious, and this generation corresponds to typical examples of the non-religious from Western Europe, and I found often myself thinking of them in terms of fuzzy fidelity or vicarious religion or cultural Christianity. Now, middle-aged and younger generations, they are a bit different. They are not socialized into religion, and they had lived all their life in a society with almost no public visibility of religion. And therefore, I was also interested in their motives for participating in my study. And mostly it boiled down to these three topics. They wanted to help the sciences, they wanted to figure out something about themselves, or it provided them a possibility to talk about religion. And I would say it's rather telling both about their self-perception and general religious situation. Now, there is one example up there who learned that he might be an atheist at the university, and he identified as an atheist only once during the interview with me. And I'm asking you, so how often have you identified as an atheist? And he tells me that in principle never. Today is the first time, because you know, in Estonia everybody assumes that you're, yeah, in Estonia they don't really ask things like that. And then I have actually a multitude of similar examples. And also I think this illustrates well the aspect that Chris Cotter mentions, that we should not talk about identities, but about acts of identification which depend on a particular context. And then this is further illustrated by the curious cases of conversion. People are coming to the interview as atheists, but leave as Christians or earth believers. So I began to feel myself partly as a missionary for different local religions. But what happened actually was that I simply provided a possibility for religion-related talk. And while engaging with this religion, my interlocutors realized that they are not that non-religious at all. And also this illustrates that the labels can have different meanings depending on the context. For instance, my interlocutors often reported identifying as atheists when approached by Jehovah's Witnesses, and when they continued walking after that, they said, "I'm an atheist." So basically, "I'm an atheist" in this situation means leave me alone. And also it can lead to speculations about, let's say, latent non-religiosity. And here I provide an alternative definition of secularization. It's a scarcity of situations where the discourses of non-religion or religion could be articulated. And here is another excerpt where we discuss the connections with religion, and my interlocutor tells me that he is a big fan of Afro-American culture and could talk about sports and rap and stuff for ages. And then there is Muhammad Ali and all those famous people, and they don't seem bad people at all. But then there is this Muslim is a person. There is this another, and I help him saying Islam. Yes, Islam, and it's bad, isn't it? Or at least this is what we are told. And then I had another co-worker, and he's also a total atheist, and he had read Old Testament, and he said that Old Testament is as brutal as Islam. So as you see, there is a definitely negative aura around Islam and Judaism, but and the story actually illustrates a couple of things. First, this indirect connection with religion, and his knowledge on the topics doesn't base on actual contact, but on media or hearsay. But what is actually even more important here is his lack of vocabulary on religion, and he tries to express, when he tries to express his feelings about Islam, but he lacks terminology, so I have to help him. And by analyzing my informants speaking about religion, I identified something that I call secularization of language. And what I mean by that is that my informants from middle-aged and younger generation often lack terminology and words, and it really seems that speaking about religion can be compared to speaking in foreign language at beginner's level. And this is the aspect that has been dubbed as religious illiteracy. And next, what happens during secularization of language is that initially religious terminology loses or changes its meaning. For instance, the church. It often means only the building and not the organization or certain group of people. And the reason for that is the church as a building is the only aspect that is relevant for my interviewees, since they don't have a contact with church as an organization or with people who belong to church. And then there are negative connotations with certain words. Believer associates with mental problem, religion associates with brainwashing, and finally, there are even changes in grammar. And I'm increasingly hearing people saying religial instead of religious. And the only way I can explain it is that they use the word so seldom that they just don't know which adjective ending to use. Now, all of this could be easily interpreted as indifference toward religion, but I think this is not the case. I think only few of my interlocutors were indifferent toward religion, and most of them expressed all kinds of feelings. And I think mostly the situation boils down to the lack of possibilities to engage with religion. So instead, they should be considered just ignorant. They cannot speak religion, so to say. But what is more important is that often my informants are not able to recognize religion at all. And here is the case of religion blindness. And it's from my own experience. So here is a church in my hometown which got hit during the Second World War, and after the war the church tower was demolished and the whole building was turned into a gym. And I passed the building often during the Soviet era, and I was completely taken aback after the collapse of the Soviet Union when it turned out that it was initially a religious building. And what I thought was nice windows. And I have had the same story from many of my informants. And while talking about religious buildings, here is a conversation with an informant who is about to marry her girlfriend. And he tells me that actually he wanted it to happen in the church, but then he learned from his girlfriend that he has to be baptized to get married in the church, and then quickly drops the whole idea. But when I ask him why did she pick the church, he tells me, I don't know, because everybody does it. Church is such a cool place, so big, but well, since I'm not baptized, I can do it anyway, so be it. Maybe I've been brainwashed by the mass media or the Hollywood movies, but the church seemed like a great place to get married. And as you see, he interprets the church only in terms of visual attractiveness, and not as an inherently religious space. And also he says everybody does it. And then he tells me that probably he got the idea from Hollywood movies. And when I checked this interview transcription, I found that he reported visiting the church only a couple of times during his entire lifetime, and these cases were not his friends' weddings. So I think he was indeed influenced by American movies, which created an illusion that church weddings are popular. But actually, only 15% of marriages in Estonia take place religiously. And this is also an interesting case because the church weddings in Estonia have become something like a mirror image of secular weddings in the United Kingdom conducted by Humanists UK, which are praised for personal service and attitude. And this is what you choose when you don't want a production line approach. And there are two more points which I want to make here. One is that given the statistics and my interviews, religious marriages are not even considered, often not considered an option for my informants. So it's not justified placing life cycle rituals automatically on religion-related field. And second point is that the idea of church wedding actually came from American context, and this is not based on actual contact with religion. So the situation in Estonia turned out to be rather different, demanding all kinds of additional commitments. And it turns out that some of my informants really have been socialized to both religion and non-religion through internet and media. And this is often the case with new atheism and the YouTube videos. And these informants knew more about religion in America than about religion in Estonia. And now taking a look at the main discourses that define Estonian non-religion in the middle-aged and younger generation, here is the list. In general, I would say that their discursive repertoire about religion is rather limited. And in my interviews, there were, of course, all kinds of discourses present. But when generalized, the recurring motives turned out to be quite small in numbers. So first, there is an influence of national narrative. Almost all my interviews, I heard the phrases forced upon and fire and sword. Then there was a set of discourses regarding public space, and here the idea that non-religion is a norm defined all the other discourses. While most of my informants discussed quite fluently their own ideas, beliefs and practices, most of them had very little to say about religion in macro or meso level because they just don't see it. And even if they speak of religion being a cause for wars, they interpret their knowledge on global situation against Estonian background. And therefore, they deduct that religion cannot be a real social force. And this is also the reason why most of my interviewees started to laugh when I asked them, do we need a secularist organization in Estonia? And here is another dominant discourse in these interviews, that religion is entirely separate from real life, for what they call real life. And this has probably to do with Soviet era influences. And concerning Soviet era, there were not many discourses, but mostly this negative attitude, although it could be a feature of global non-religious culture, if there is something like that. But also most of my informants said that they are tolerant towards religion, but their usage of language was often loaded with a pejorative tonality. And finally, the most important discourse which was present in all my interviews was the idea that religion is for the weak and troubled. And religion may be used as the last resort, but the price is really high. The loss of personal freedom due to the dogmatic thinking that accompanies religion. And this religion we're talking about is very clearly Christianity, but what was a surprise for me was that alternative spirituality was not a topic of discussion that often, although there were some of my younger informants for whom the alternative spirituality was the main mirror for their non-religiosity. Now, yeah, so far so good, but now we have reached my main dilemma, namely that there are a lot of different discourses within Estonian non-religion, but the problem I cannot get past is that most of these discourses do not derive from an actual contact with religion, and they are products of what I would call imagined religion or an idea of religion. So my question is, does it mean that their non-religiosity is also imagined? And Chris Cotter finishes his book saying that there is no data for non-religion based on the understanding that there are no things that are inherently religious or not. And I totally agree with this. But additionally, I want to state the same. There is no data for non-religion, but based on the notion that sometimes there is no religion in this religion-related field that this non-religion could differ from. Yes. And now turning to this positive contents of Estonian non-religiosity, when I studied these interview transcripts, I noticed that my informants often describe their non-religiosity in terms of structural elements of religion. I don't believe, I'm not baptized, and so on. But then reading on, I understood that their difference from religion actually is based on the function on religion. And also, when I've reflected over this text, I noticed at some point that we didn't speak almost about my interviewees' work, but spent a lot of time discussing their leisure time. So, and since religion is about coping with reality and personal problems, then religion in religion-related field, their non-religion, is about dealing with the same in a different way. So it's about physical and spiritual existential health. That means personal well-being. And how do they do that, deal with the same in a different way? They go for a walk in the forest. And here is this trope, the forest. The forest is my church. And together with my colleague, David Churfield from Sweden, we explored the role of nature in association with secularization, and also conducted interviews among secular Swedes and Estonians. And here are the results we found. So concerning nature, there are many well-being related discourses, and there are many religion related those discourses. So it's quite safe to state that nature definitely situates in a religion related field. And I would say that in Estonia and other Nordic countries, nature is often the main competitor with religion as a provider of existential health. And in Estonian case, there is also this overlap with the national identity and nature and anti-Christian rhetorics of earth belief, which adds, yes, another layer to this. But also there are many other competitors, such as family, hobbies, but mostly this competition takes place at micro level. And what is even more fun is that the same discourse was evoked in 2016 in the scandal over the inauguration of Estonian president who refused to go to the church after inauguration. as it was a tradition since the re-establishment of Estonian Republic in 1991. And her example was now followed by our current president as well. But here is the explanation our ex-president offered through Facebook. I respect freedom of religion, but attending the services during national and religious holidays would have not been sincere since this has not been my custom before. We all seek consolation from where we can find, some from the church, some from the sea, some from the forest. This is everybody's own choice, and this I consider the most important. So, and here are my conclusions for today, so that religion and non-religion are not only relational, they are also situational, and the same elements in different settings, for instance, funerals or weddings, may or may not situate on religion-related field. Also, religious socialization and public visibility of religion are very important factors defining religion-related discourses among the non-religious. Also, traditional features of religion may not be suitable for studying religion and non-religion in secularized or post-Christian context, and I would say perhaps even this religion-related field may appear as too narrow, and perhaps it is justified to redefine it from the start as existential field. And also, I would say that religion related discourses among the non-religious may be significantly different from believers and scholarly discourses, and this has to be taken into account when studying non-religion. And also, last remark, that different generations of the non-religious may speak different dialects. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atko. That was absolutely fascinating. Just thinking about some of the questions we're asking in the Non-Religion: A Complex Future project, we've also turned our attention to nature and the conceptualization of nature. And I think you will inspire us to think a little bit more carefully about that, thinking about the situation in Estonia. I'm inviting questions, I think I'm doing this correctly, to write your questions in chat, questions or comments, and I will then present them to Atko. I'm not seeing any, but I could be not seeing things properly too.
You see, there are 3 questions.
Okay. The Q&A feature, not chat. Okay, sorry about that. There we are. Okay. All right. We have, 3 questions. So Linda Woodhead, hi Atko, thank you for an extremely interesting talk. A conclusion is that religion has to be learned. A study among students in the UK shows high level of engagement with tarot and astrology, especially with women. They often engage daily via apps, but say it's not religion, it's not science. So what is it? Magic? Mystery? Is not being religion or science seems to be part of the appeal. Is it the same or different in Estonia? And I want to add to Linda's question and just ask you about that, because you mentioned alternative spirituality. So I just wanted you to elaborate on that. And I think that links nicely with Linda's question.
Yes, this is a very important question. Actually, it was interesting that I didn't seem to find much about new spirituality among my non-religious informants, because actually the alternative spirituality here is it's being already argued that this is now our main religion. And then in this sense, it was really weird not to see that in the context of non-religion. And yes, but unfortunately, I don't know much about the studies on new spirituality in Estonia. Yes, sorry about that. I know a couple of my colleagues have studied that, but not from social media and this app-related expressions of that.
Thank you. Pascal Tanner has a really interesting question. Speaking of forced secularization, I would like to ask a question related to a specific characteristic of Estonian society. Estonia is known for a progressive attitude towards digital transformation. I think of internet access as human right and electronic identity cards. Now, to what extent does this policy influence the field of the non-religious? Can we speak of a continuation of what you called forced secularization in this regard?
This is really an interesting question, but I have never thought of that in that sense. So the only topic that comes to mind is this already studied feature of new atheism that is being spread, so to say, through YouTube channels and so on.
Thank you. I'm looking, there was another question. Sorry, I'm trying to find it, but Chris Cotter just had a comment. He wanted to say it was a great talk and is really pushing the Western European, North American scholarship in incredibly fruitful directions. Thank you. And I wanted to echo Chris's comment. I think so too. I'm absolutely fascinated by what you are seeing in Estonia. Brian Cragen says, I'm really interested in your distinction between indifferent and ignorant. Many scholars consider the end stage of secularization religious indifferent. Would you disagree and argue that it is eventually ignorance? And are these mutually exclusive? And I want to tag, I'm taking host prerogative, I want to tag a question on to Ryan's question and ask you, what are the consequences of that? I mean, I love the way that you are thinking about this in terms of the vocabulary. And you've touched a little bit on this already, but what are the consequences of the lack of vocabulary or the ignorance that you propose or that you've mentioned? Are there consequences, for example, for social inclusion, equality? Yeah, I'll just leave it there and let you sort of pick up on Ryan's question about this difference between indifferent and ignorant.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a great question. Actually, I also thought of Estonian non-religiosity long time as of the expression of indifference. But then when it was before I started to interview the non-religious people in Estonia, and then it quickly turned out that I was wrong. And this, when they indeed get in touch with religion, it's not indifference. It's often curiosity. It's all kinds of stuff, and it's definitely not indifference, but ignorance. I think, unfortunately, I had to throw out many slides with the examples of people being unable to express their ideas, their feelings even about religion, because they just didn't know the words. and I think, well, perhaps they are interconnected. I mean, ignorance and indifference in this case. So first then comes ignorance, and then it could go into indifference, because they just have no contact with religion. But in case there is a contact, then this is definitely not indifference.
Thank you. And do you have reflections on the consequences of that for Estonian society, just simply in terms of inclusion, thinking about how people, and there's a related question. I really am reluctant to try to pronounce the first name. Zoki Kitsal Luna, religion in Russia was an ideological force to unite the country at Perestroika. Would you mind to comment what provided unity in Estonia after the collapse of the Soviet Union? So just asking about broader Estonian social structure.
The unity in Estonia, it was definitely not religion. Estonians were very big on religion about 4 years, from 1988 till 1992, and after that all the statistics have moved downwards. And what united, I think, was the bad economical situation.
Hannah McKillop asks, she says, and I was too struck by the statistic that of 31% of those in Estonia have religious funerals. And she's wondering, do you know what the dominant afterlife beliefs of Estonians are, both for the religious and non-religious?
Yes, this is a great question. I understand you might get an impression from my presentation today that Estonians may be total atheists, but actually this is far from true. There are very many all kinds of afterlife beliefs and all kinds of that, both among the believers, among non-religious. And if I remember correctly, there was even statistics that 12% of atheists believed in personal God. So it tells us also something.
Margaret Warburg writes a related comment, and she just like your reflections on this. The comment is one about the forest. I've interviewed around 50 people who want to be buried in the forest. The burial itself is on non-consecrated ground, and 75% of the Danish population are members of the church. So I thought that maybe we could find all the non-religious here, but no, I think of the forest and the forest burials as a vessel you can put religious, spiritual, and non-religious thoughts into. And she just wondered if I think you had any comments.
Yes, I definitely agree that forest is not inherently non-religious. It can be indeed a vessel for everything. Yeah.
Conrad Hackett writes, great talk regarding socialization. Could you talk about how religious parents in Estonia may or may not be exposing their children to religion?
I think it is mostly primary socialization, because in Estonia we have religious education only about in 10% of schools. So in the context where religion is almost absent from public space, it's basically the only option.
Lena Kula writes, really interesting presentation. You referred to the experience during communism as an important factor, but in other former communist countries like Poland and Russia, there has been a different story. What would be the main factors in explaining the Estonian way? Would you describe what you describe reminds me of the situation in the Nordic countries. I wonder about the role of Protestantism in Estonia.
This is also a very good question. Yes, exactly. I think Protestantism is one of the factors. And what differs Estonia from Poland, I think, is the national identity and this anti-Christian strand in Estonian national narrative. I think this is the main explanation.
Thank you. Ryan Cragen writes, broad level secularization question. Why did the forced secularization work in Estonia, but not in other former Soviet countries like Russia? Does this have to do with the linkage of religious nationalism and authoritarian regimes?
I would explain it again with this nationalism part, but also perhaps Estonia started to secularize already before the Soviet occupation.
Mohammed Jabir Ali writes, hi Atko, thank you for this insightful talk. During your presentation, you mentioned that some non-religious people view religion as something for the weak. How acknowledging and accommodating are the non-religious population in Estonia that sometimes require the belief in religion or a higher power to get through the crises of life? And I wanted to add on to that too, just a question about religious freedom and what does religious freedom look like in Estonia? And so just, yes, yeah, I mean, whatever you choose to respond to.
Yeah. Well, actually, it was most of my informants that regarded religion as for the weak. But, well, how to say, Estonia, we have freedom of religion. Everybody is free to believe what they want to, but the problem is with these negative connotations with religion-related beliefs, which yeah, are not expressed publicly, and therefore they are considered somewhat, I don't know, yeah, weird.
Okay. Flavio Lages Rodriguez says, Atko Remmel, what could you say about the non-religious aspect of heavy metal, especially black metal? Something about Satanism, paganism, or other modes of expression that appear to be in conflict with institutional religion has come up in your research.
Yes, thank you for that question. We do. We have a heavy metal group here in Estonia, which is very much neo-pagan influenced, and also many of their songs are anti-Christian. So we do have that, yes.
Michael Rundle writes, in Estonia, the presence of religion in public institutions has often been considered problematic. The chaplaincy service in the armed forces and prisons and religious education in state schools have often been criticized as vehicles for religious indoctrination by Christian denominations in general, or the Lutheran Church in particular. Non-Christian religious associations are indeed represented by just one Muslim chaplain in the armed forces, but the situation does reflect the reality of Estonian society, where approximately 98% of the followers of some religious traditions are in fact Christians. I'm not sure if there's a question or a comment you'd like to address.
This seems more like a comment. Thank you.
Okay. I'm sorry. I think Ryan had another question. I'm also Ryan Cragen. I'm also really interested in how your interviewees thought about the functions of religion when considering what non-religion is. Two questions. First, do your interviewees think of themselves as non-religious, or would that require them to position themselves vis-a-vis religion, which they just don't think about? And second, do you think non-religion is effectively just the replacement of religious functions with non-religious ones?
The last one, no. I think non-religion is just different and maybe even entirely different depending on the context. And as for the first question, actually most of my interviewees didn't have any identification or identity. This is they just didn't have the possibility to enact it in a way. So they are sort of, I think, artificial, these identities that that have been reported here.
Thank you. Alexander Zamusinski, sorry, Alexander, writes, while majority of Estonians reject their association with Christian beliefs and practices, is it true that many people there shifted their focus to ideas of karma, reincarnation, and neo-pagan belief, animism? What is the percentage of such people in Estonia? Why do you think it is not a religious belief? Do you think they are materialists? Can you really call such people atheist? Sorry, I was not convinced that they are atheists. Can you please clarify? And I think your end comment may have said something to this, but please elaborate.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't say I think of them as atheists. They are definitely not. And actually, there was not enough time to include all my material, but actually they do have all kinds of beliefs, both in from this world and another. And often there was a curious situation that they sort of choose what to believe in certain situations. So this is, I'm explaining this situation with this belief. Now, for instance, there is a karma, there is a karma, but actually I might think of that tomorrow completely differently. So this is what I gathered. So there were all kinds of different beliefs, but in some cases I didn't see that these beliefs actually have an impact on their life. They were just curious pieces of information.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze one last question. There are more than that, and I apologize to those of you whose questions I haven't posed because there are some excellent questions left. Hillary Kale writes, I'm curious about the word religion itself. Even in my US field sites, which are quite religious from a scholar's perspective, the word religion will often be rejected by people, especially Protestants, in favor of words that connote a personal God. You mentioned that even 12% of atheists believe in a personal God. This is one of Ryan Cragen's interesting comments sometimes. My question, what language are you using in the interviews? Is it the word religion, or is there another word in Estonian, for example, church? And is there also a general view that a relationship with a personal God is for the weak, or is weakness associated only with the involvement as religious at a more institutional level?
No, that religion is for the weak. This is associated with the concept of religion as something separate, something, a thing, basically. And sorry, I lost the question here.
The wording of your questions.
Oh yeah, yes. We spoke about religion. We do have another word, usk, which means literally belief, but we talked about religion mostly. Yes, and yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm in the interest of time. Unfortunately, there are questions I'm not posing. And my apologies to those of you whose questions I have not been able to get to. They're all fascinating. Atko, obviously, there's a great deal of interest in what you're doing and studying and thinking about in Estonia, and the ways in which you're framing your questions, your analysis, thinking about the broader relationship between Estonian society and this thing we call religion and these things we call religion and non-religion. Thank you so much for being with us today for this fascinating lecture, and hopefully we can have continuing conversations with you as your research unfolds.
Thank you everyone for questions and for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Atko, and thank you all for joining us today for your excellent questions. If you just take a look in the general chat, I have shared links to our websites. The NCF's next event, Religion at the Edge, Findings from the Cascadia Project, is 1 week from today. There's a registration link with more info below. We hope to see you again soon, and thank you all so much.